The early hours of January 30th, 1968, should have been peaceful. In Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, American and South Vietnamese soldiers were celebrating Tet, the Lunar New Year, the most important holiday in Vietnamese culture. Traditionally, both sides respected a ceasefire during the festivities. But that night, as fireworks exploded in the skies in celebration, other types of explosions began to echo through the streets. Suddenly, without warning, more than 80,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese fighters emerged from the shadows. They simultaneously attacked over 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam. American military bases were invaded. The U.S. Embassy in Saigon, a symbol of American power in the region, was surrounded. Guerrillas dressed in black uniforms and tired sandals scaled the walls of the fortified complex. For 6 hours, fierce fighting occurred in the embassy's well-kept gardens, while television cameras captured every moment. For the American public, watching those images in their living rooms, the shock was absolute. For years, generals and politicians had assured them that the war was being won, that the enemy was weakened, that victory was just a matter of time. But now, on the television screen, Vietnamese guerrillas were fighting inside the American embassy. If the United States was winning, why was the enemy able to strike at the very heart of American power? The Tet Offensive, as it became known, was a turning point. Militarily, it was a defeat for the North Vietnamese. They suffered devastating losses. Over 40,000 fighters died. None of the captured cities remained under communist control for more than a few days. In tactical terms, the Americans won, but in strategic terms, the North Vietnamese achieved something far more important. They destroyed the American narrative. They proved that after years of bombing, hundreds of thousands of troops, and billions of dollars spent, they were still capable of attacking anywhere, at any time. And they did it in front of the cameras, for the whole world to see. Walter Cronkite, America's most trusted television journalist, reported from Vietnam after the offensive. His words were a devastating blow to the Johnson administration. To say that we are closer to victory today is to believe in the optimistic authors who got us into this mess. It's increasingly obvious that the only rational way out will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who have fulfilled their promise to defend democracy and done the best they could. When President Lyndon Johnson watched that broadcast, he reportedly said, "If we've lost Cronkite, we've lost America." He was right. Months later, Johnson announced he would not run for re-election. The war that was supposed to be quick and decisive had become an endless nightmare. But how did this happen? How did the most powerful nation in the world, with the most advanced military force in history, lose a war against an agrarian, poor country with no significant air force or navy? The answer lies not just in tactics or strategies. It lies in the very nature of the war the United States tried to fight. To understand the American defeat, we need to go back to the beginning. In 1964, when the first American combat troops landed in Vietnam, the mission seemed clear. South Vietnam, an ally of the United States, was being invaded by communist forces from the north, supported by the Soviet Union and China. It was the Cold War in action. If South Vietnam fell, Americans believed the whole region would follow like a row of dominoes. Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, perhaps even Indonesia. Communism would spread like a disease. American generals planned the war as if it were a smaller version of World War II. There would be massive bombings to destroy enemy infrastructure. Ground troops would control territory. The enemy, facing the overwhelming power of the American military, would be forced to surrender. It was a formula that had worked against Germany and Japan. Why wouldn't it work against Vietnamese peasants? But Vietnam was not Germany. There were no tank factories to bomb. There were no vital railways that, if destroyed, would paralyze the enemy. There was no capital that, once captured, would end the war. Vietnam was an agrarian, decentralized country where most of the population lived in rural villages. Destroying cities did not prevent the Viet Cong from fighting. They simply disappeared into the jungle and returned when the Americans left. From the beginning, the Americans misjudged success. They believed the war could be won through attrition, killing so many enemies that eventually they would have no more men to fight. Every night, generals demanded reports of body count. The count of enemy bodies, the higher the number, the better. Units reporting high enemy death counts received praise and promotions. But this system was fundamentally broken. First, because it was almost impossible to distinguish between Viet Cong fighters and Vietnamese civilians. A peasant working in the rice fields during the day could be a guerrilla at night. Civilian clothing did not mean innocence. So, American soldiers, under pressure to increase the body count, began counting any Vietnamese killed as an enemy. Old people, women, even children were included in the reports. The My Lai massacre, where American soldiers killed over 500 unarmed civilians, was the most horrific example, but it was not an isolated case. Secondly, because the numbers were often fabricated or exaggerated, platoon commanders inflated numbers to impress superiors. Higher-ranking officers inflated them even more to show progress to Washington. The result was that generals in Saigon and politicians in Washington believed that tens of thousands of Viet Cong were being killed every month. But the reality was very different. And third, and most importantly, because the strategy of attrition only works if the enemy has limited manpower resources. But North Vietnam had a population of 20 million people, and the government was willing to sacrifice as many as necessary. Ho Chi Minh, the North Vietnamese leader, had made it clear, "You can kill 10 of our men for every one we kill of yours. But even at that rate, you will lose and we will win." He was right. The terrain of Vietnam was as lethal an enemy as the Viet Cong. The country is covered with dense tropical jungles, steep mountains, muddy rice paddies, and winding rivers. The climate is brutal, suffocating heat, oppressive humidity, torrential rains during the monsoon season that turned roads into rivers of mud. For Americans used to fight in open fields in Europe or the deserts of North Africa, the Vietnamese jungle was a nightmare. Visibility was reduced to a few meters. Giant trees blocked the sun, creating perpetual twilight. The jungle floor was covered with vegetation so dense that clearing a path required machetes and hours of exhausting labor. Poisonous snakes, leeches, scorpions, and tropical diseases lurked in every shadow. Americans relied on heavy equipment, tanks, armored vehicles, supply trucks, but this equipment was practically useless in the jungle. Tanks became stuck in the mud. Trucks could not cross rivers or climb mountains. Roads were easy targets for ambushes. The Viet Cong simply needed to wait for an American column to pass down a narrow road in the jungle, detonate buried explosives, and disappear before reinforcements arrived. Americans tried to compensate with air power. Helicopters, especially the iconic Ku-He-Xuan Huey, became the symbol of American mobility. They could transport troops over the jungle, landing in clearings to conduct search and destroy operations. But helicopters were vulnerable. Viet Cong armed with anti-aircraft, machine guns, and later portable missiles supplied by the Soviets, regularly shot down helicopters. The distinct sound of the Huey's blades, which was supposed to represent salvation for American soldiers, became an omen of death. American bombers dropped more explosives on Vietnam than were used in all of World War II. Operation Rolling Thunder, which lasted from 1965 to 1968, dropped hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs on North Vietnam. Cities, bridges, factories, roads. Everything was targeted. Americans used napalm, a gelatinous substance that adhered to skin and burned at extreme temperatures, turning entire forests into hells. They used Agent Orange, a chemical herbicide, to defoliate the jungle and expose Viet Cong hideouts. But none of this broke the Vietnamese will to fight. The bombed bridges were rebuilt in days by thousands of workers using primitive methods. Supplies traveling along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a complex network of paths through Laos and Cambodia, continued to flow south, carried on the backs of men and women or on modified bicycles capable of carrying hundreds of kilograms. When the jungle was burned with napalm, the Viet Cong simply moved to another area, and the bombing had disastrous political consequences. Photographs of naked Vietnamese children running, their skin burning with napalm, were broadcast around the world. Images of entire villages destroyed by American bombs generated massive protests in the United States and Europe. The war that was supposed to be about defending democracy began to look like a brutal aggression against a defenseless people. But the most impressive adaptation of the Viet Cong was not above ground. It was underneath it. Beginning in the 1940s, during the war against the French, Vietnamese began to dig tunnels to hide from bombings. Over the years, especially during the American War, these tunnels expanded into something extraordinary, underground networks that stretched for hundreds of kilometers, connecting entire villages with multiple levels of depth. The most famous tunnels were those of Siu Chi, near Saigon. They were a complete underground city. There were meeting rooms, hospitals, kitchens, weapons caches, dormitories, and even theaters where soldiers watched propaganda shows. The tunnels had deadly traps, pits with poisoned stakes, scorpions and boxers that would drop when doors were opened, grenades connected to booby traps. The entrances were nearly impossible to detect. Trapdoors hidden under leaves, camouflaged on the jungle floor, so small that only thin men could pass through. The Viet Cong, mostly smaller and lighter than the Americans, could disappear into these entrances in seconds. Inside the tunnels, the air was suffocating. There was little oxygen, intense heat, total darkness. Bats, rats, and insects infested the corridor, but the Viet Cong lived there, sometimes for months. They would emerge at night to attack American bases, plant mines, ambush patrols. Then, before dawn, they would disappear back underground. Americans tried to destroy the tunnels. They dumped thousands of liters of water inside them, trying to drown the occupants. They pumped in poison gas. They sent in tunnel rats, small volunteer soldiers who could enter the tunnels with flashlights and pistols, hunting Viet Cong in the dark. It was a terrifying job. Tunnel rats crawled through tight passages, never knowing if they would encounter an armed enemy around the next corner or fall into a deadly trap. Nothing worked completely. The tunnels were too extensive, too well built. When one section was destroyed, the Viet Cong simply dug another, and the tunnels became a powerful symbol of the war. They showed that no matter how much military power the Americans had, the Vietnamese would always find a way to keep fighting. But perhaps the greatest American mistake was not military. It was political and cultural. Vietnam was the first television war. For the first time in history, war correspondents carried TV cameras into the battlefield. Every night, Americans sitting in their living rooms watched real images of combat, soldiers shooting, bodies being carried, villages in flames, children crying. During World War II, news was filtered. There was censorship. Photographs and reports were approved by the military before being published. The public saw a sanitized version of the war. Brave soldiers fighting evil, glorious victories, noble sacrifices. In Vietnam, that filter disappeared. Reporters had unprecedented freedom to film and broadcast whatever they wanted. And what they filmed was not glorious. It was brutal, chaotic, and often horrific. One of the most iconic images of the war was taken in 1968. A South Vietnamese general on the streets of Saigon executed a Viet Cong prisoner with a shot to the head at point-blank range. Photographer Eddie Adams captured the exact moment the bullet entered the man's skull. That photos appeared in newspapers around the world. It won the Pulitzer Prize, and it generated massive outrage. If this was the kind of ally the United States was defending, many Americans asked, was the war worth it? Another devastating image showed a 9-year-old girl, Kim Phak, running naked down a road, her skin burning with napalm dropped by South Vietnamese planes, ironically not Americans, but supplied by the U.S. Her screams of pain were audible on the video. That image destroyed any narrative that the war was clean or necessary, and there were the daily news of American casualties. Every day, television announced how many soldiers had died. At first, the numbers were small, dozens per week, but as the war intensified, the numbers grew. Hundreds per week, thousands per month. American families watched, horrified, as the numbers increased, knowing that their children, brothers, husbands were there. Protests began on college campuses. Students facing conscription to fight in a war they didn't understand burned their draft cards in public demonstrations. "Hell no, we won't go" became a battle cry. In 1968, during the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, violent protests erupted in the streets. Police beat protesters with tear gas filled the air. The country was dividing. Veterans returning from Vietnam were not welcomed as heroes. Unlike World War II soldiers who returned to parades and celebrations, Vietnam veterans were often spit on, insulted, called baby killers. Many developed severe post-traumatic stress disorder, but there was little support or understanding. They had been sent to fight a war that their own country had rejected. Underscore. While Americans fought against public opinion at home and the terrain in Vietnam, the North Vietnamese followed a completely different strategy. They didn't need to win battles. They just needed not to lose the war. Ho Chi Minh and General Vo Nguyen Giap, the military genius behind the Vietnamese strategy, understood something fundamental. The United States was stronger militarily but was not willing to fight forever. The war was being fought thousands of kilometers from American territory. No American city was being bombed. No American civilian was dying. The only thing at stake for the United States was prestige and ideology. But for the Vietnamese, everything was at stake. Their cities were being bombed. Their families were being killed. Their country was being destroyed. And they had fought against foreign invaders for 1,000 years. Chinese, Mongols, French, a few more decades against the Americans didn't scare them. The Vietnamese strategy had three main components. First, relentless guerrilla warfare. Never give the Americans a conventional battle that they could easily win. Instead, use ambushes, traps, nighttime attacks, kill a few American soldiers, and disappear before reinforcements arrived. Make every day in Vietnam dangerous and exhausting. Destroy American morale through 1,000 small cuts. Not one decisive blow. Second, exploit American political limitations. The Vietnamese knew that the United States would not completely invade North Vietnam because that would risk a war with China. So they used the North as a sanctuary, knowing they were relatively safe there. The Ho Chi Minh Trail passed through Laos and Cambodia, supposedly neutral countries that the Americans could not officially attack without creating diplomatic crises. Third, win the propaganda war. Every American bombing that killed civilians was propaganda for the Vietnamese. Every atrocity, every village burned, fed the narrative that Americans were brutal invaders. And that narrative was not just for domestic consumption. It was broadcast globally, undermining international support for the American war. And the Vietnamese were willing to suffer tremendously. It is estimated that between 2 and 3 million Vietnamese died during the war. Soldiers and civilians. Entire cities were devastated. Generations were decimated, but they never considered surrender. There is a famous story of a post-war encounter between an American colonel and a North Vietnamese colonel. The American said, "You know you never defeated us in a battle." The Vietnamese replied, "That may be true, but it is also irrelevant." In 1973, under overwhelming political pressure, the United States signed the Paris Peace Accords and withdrew its combat troops from Vietnam. The South Vietnamese government was left alone, supported only by American supplies and money. 2 years later, in 1975, North Vietnam launched a final offensive without American air support, without American troops. The South Vietnamese army collapsed. Within weeks, soldiers abandoned their weapons and fled. Generals betrayed their units. The South Vietnamese president fled the country with gold and embezzled money. On April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks broke through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. The war was over. Vietnam would be reunified under communist control. The final images were humiliating for the United States. Helicopters evacuated American embassy personnel from the rooftop of the building while desperate. Crowds of South Vietnamese tried to get in, pleading to be taken. Some clung to the helicopter skids as they took off, falling to their deaths when they could hold on no longer. Helicopters were pushed into the sea from aircraft carriers to make room for more arriving aircraft. It was the ignominious end of a war that had consumed 58,220 American lives and cost over $168 billion at the time, more than $1 trillion adjusted for inflation. And all for nothing. Vietnam fell to the communists anyway. So, why did the greatest power in the world lose? The answer is not simple, because it never is. Wars are not won or lost for a single reason, but some truths emerge from the ashes of Vietnam. First truth. Military power is not everything. The United States had the best planes, the best tanks, the best weapons. But wars are not won solely with equipment. They are won with will, strategy, and understanding of what you are fighting for. Second truth. You cannot win a war that the people do not support. Without American public support, the war was unsustainable. And in a democracy, with a free press and televisions showing the reality of war every night, that support was impossible to maintain as the war dragged on indefinitely. Third truth. Knowing the terrain and culture is vital. The Americans never fully understood Vietnam. They viewed the war through the lens of the Cold War. Communism versus democracy. But for many Vietnamese, it was a war of national independence. They were not fighting for communist ideology. They were fighting against foreign invaders, as they had done for 1,000 years. Fourth truth. There are limits to what force can achieve. You can bomb a country to rubble, but you cannot bomb it into loving you. The Americans destroyed much of Vietnam, but with each bomb, each burned village, each dead civilian, they created more enemies. Fifth truth. Strategic patience wins over tactical haste. The Vietnamese understood that they did not need to win quickly. They just needed to survive until the Americans gave up. And they were right. 50 years later, Vietnam still bears the physical scars of war. Craters from bombs cover the interior. Agent Orange contaminated the soil and water, causing birth defects in children born decades after the end of the war. Millions of unexploded landmines still kill and maim people every year. But the deeper scars are psychological in the United States. Vietnam Syndrome persists, a deep fear of engaging in prolonged foreign wars without clear objectives and public support. Whenever the United States considers military intervention, the ghost of Vietnam is invoked. Will this be another Vietnam? Has become a defining question of American foreign policy. For American veterans, the wounds have never fully healed. Suicide rates among Vietnam veterans remain alarmingly high. PTSD, substance abuse, depression, the invisible wars that continue long after the guns fall silent. And there are questions that have never been fully answered. Was it worth it? The 58,000 dead Americans, the millions of dead Vietnamese, the division of American society, the devastating financial cost, all to prevent Vietnam from becoming communist. But Vietnam became communist anyway. And today, ironically, Vietnam is a trading partner of the United States, with American companies operating freely in Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City. So, we return to the original question. Why did the greatest power in the world lose to farmers? The answer is that they were never just farmers. They were seasoned fighters with decades of experience in guerrilla warfare. They were supported by superpowers. The Soviet Union and China supplied them with weapons, training, and resources. They were motivated by a cause they considered existential, the independence of their nation. And they were led by brilliant strategists who understood that they did not need to win battles, only survive until the Americans gave up. But more importantly, they won because the Americans lost something essential to winning any war: the will to fight. When soldiers do not know why they are fighting, when the people at home do not support the war, when each day brings only senseless death and invisible progress, defeat is inevitable. It does not matter how many tanks you have, how many planes, how many bombs. Vietnam taught a brutal lesson. Wars are not won solely on the battlefield. They are won in the hearts and minds of the people who fight them and those who support them. And when those people decide that the war is no longer worth it, no amount of military power can change the outcome. The Vietnamese called their struggle Kahachin Chiang, resistance, and resistance is exactly what they did. They resisted the French. They resisted the Japanese. They resisted the Americans, not because they were stronger, but because they were willing to suffer more, wait longer, sacrifice more. In the end, the Vietnam War was not lost in rice paddies or jungles. It was lost in American living rooms where families watched their children die in a war they could not understand. It was lost on college campuses where young people refused to fight. It was lost in the halls of power in Washington, where politicians realized that continuing the war would cost them their careers. And perhaps most deeply, it was lost in American arrogance, the belief that military power was enough, that technology would overcome determination, that a wealthy and advanced nation would inevitably defeat a poor agrarian country. Vietnam proved that these assumptions were wrong, and generations of American and Vietnamese soldiers paid the price for that lesson with their lives, their limbs, their minds, and their futures. That is the true story of why America lost in Vietnam. There are no simple heroes or clear villains, just the brutal tragedy of a war that should never have been fought, and the bloody proof that even the greatest powers have limits.